The first gray light of dawn did not bring clarity to Vespera, it brought a blinding horror. The sheer volume of the damage, executed under the cover of a single night, was too vast for the human mind to immediately process. It defied geometry, logic, and the core concept of private space. The city woke up exposed. Imagine the sound of silence, not the calm quiet of a rural morning, but the eerie, pressurized silence of thousands of people holding their breath. The usual cacophony of Vespera, the screech of early traffic, the shouts of market vendors, the clang of the streetcar, was replaced by a chilling stillness. Everyone was looking, but no one was speaking. From the working-class tenements of the North End to the sprawling mansions of the Heights, the scene was identical. A gaping hole where an entryway should have been, framed by splintered wood and twisted hinge metal. The only barrier left was the individual's choice to stand in the breach. The impact was instantaneous and deeply psychological. People didn't step outside, they stared out. They stood behind overturned furniture or makeshift sheets, gazing at the street as if it were a predator. Their homes, once their sanctuaries, had become stages. The act was not just vandalism, it was a surgical removal of anonymity. Every person who had ever felt safe behind a locked door now realized that their private moments, their hidden possessions, their vulnerabilities, were utterly transparent. The anatomy of annihilation, the sheer scale of the operation, was a testament to Valerius's planning and control. Over 400 entry points, strategically chosen to maximize the psychological yield, lay in ruins. The residential zones. In the middle-class neighborhoods, the doors were the standard of suburban stability: solid oak, 2 deadbolts, a peephole. These required brute force, and the resulting debris piles were enormous, symbols of wealth that provided no defense. A family's antique grandfather clock might stand untouched in the hall, while the 3-inch thick door that protected it lay broken on the lawn. The message was clear: you are safe, but only by the grace of your destroyer. In the overcrowded, multi-unit buildings, the destruction was faster, but the terror was amplified by proximity. Neighbors now saw into neighbors' lives through the shattered communal hallway. The internal doors of the apartments themselves had also been breached, turning living spaces into a bizarre, interconnected maze of exposure. A man in his kitchen could wave awkwardly to a stranger in the next building's dining room. The commercial districts, the financial heart of Vespera, was equally crippled. Not by theft, but by impotence. The massive steel and glass entryway of the First Trust Bank was ripped from its pivot points. The tellers' cages, the gleaming marble lobby, all were visible to the morning crowd, yet the vaults themselves remained intact. Valerius wasn't interested in their money, he was interested in their confidence. The bank was structurally sound, but financially, the public trust was broken along with the doors. Shopkeepers arrived to find their front doors lying like ruined shields. The butcher's shop, with its thick, heavy back door designed to repel late-night raiders, was breached, the door lying among the sawdust and meat hooks. The jewelry store's ornate iron gates were bent outward like peeled tin cans. Nothing was missing. The implication was horrific. We were here. We could have taken everything. We chose to take only your peace. The systemic collapse. The most crucial targets were the institutions of control, proving that Valerius's reach was above the law. The municipal building, the city hall's great front doors, a symbol of civic stability, were now a grotesque monument to Valerius's sovereignty. Mayor Harrison arrived to find his own security detail shuffling nervously around a pile of debris. The doors to the municipal records office, the tax assessor's archives, and even the private executive bathroom, all had been obliterated. The mayor's response was crucial. He had to reassure the public, but how could he, when his own office had been so thoroughly violated? Harrison's televised address was shaky. He spoke of isolated incidents of mass vandalism and promised swift, firm action. But the camera zoomed in, slightly, on the mayor's left shoulder, and viewers could clearly see, leaning against the wall of his office behind him, the splintered remains of the very door he had locked the night before. His words were empty theater. His authority was an open secret. Law enforcement, the Vespera police headquarters, was perhaps the most devastating tableau. The heavy, double-security metal doors lay sprawled on the asphalt of the parking lot. The destruction was so complete that sunlight streamed directly into the squad room. Officers were ordered to barricade the street-facing entry with patrol cars and sandbags, a humiliating, last-minute measure. The chief of police, a man named Kessler, was apoplectic, but powerless. He knew, everyone knew, who was behind it. But the crime was too perfect. What was the charge? Vandalism? For 10,000 counts? There was no forced entry, as entry had not been gained for the purpose of crime, but for the purpose of display. Kessler's rage was personal. His own apartment door in the suburbs had been breached. His wife, a schoolteacher, had called him in hysterics, describing the terror of waking up to the sound of her bedroom door collapsing into the hallway. Valerius hadn't just attacked the chief's post, he had attacked his family's haven. Kessler convened an emergency meeting. Kessler, voice shaking with suppressed fury. We have thousands of crime scenes. We have no witnesses willing to speak. We have no motive for profit. This is organized terror. Who the hell has the logistical capacity to pull this off without a single operational failure? The answer hung heavy in the smoke-filled room. One of the younger detectives, Detective Reyes, finally spoke, his voice low. Reyes, Chief, the modus operandi is too specific. No theft. Total destruction of the boundary. It's a statement about reach. Only one man sends messages like this. Kessler, Valerius. Fine. We know it. But how do we prove it? We can't arrest him for mass destruction of property without a single piece of evidence. And if we touch him without certainty, this city will burn down overnight. We have to follow the chain. Find the small fish who broke the small doors. But the chain was already cut. Valerius's men, professional demolition workers and paid laborers from outside Vespera, were already gone, their cash payments secured, their trail cold. The revelation of Santino. Meanwhile, the city's attention briefly turned to the catalyst, Santino Morelli. When the police finally, and cautiously, made their way to the demolished warehouse complex, they didn't find a crime scene, they found a warning. The sight of the massive, locked vault door lying uselessly on the floor, torn from the wall like a loose tooth, was staggering. Inside, Santino was curled up, not physically harmed, but utterly broken. He hadn't been touched since Marcoletta's man gave him that cut. Valerius's punishment had been purely psychological. When police tried to question him, Santino couldn't form a coherent sentence. He could only point repeatedly at the piece of card left by Rocco. The answer is no. The local news picked up the story immediately. It wasn't just a powerful gangster being punished, it was the entire city being used as the instrument of that punishment. Santino had challenged Valerius's authority, and in return, Valerius had broken every citizen's door. It was an act of brutal, indirect proportional violence. The citizens didn't hate Santino for challenging Valerius, they hated him for failing to do so quietly. They hated him for bringing the wrath of the overlord down upon their own fragile homes. Santino was transferred to a mental health facility that day, not a prison. His mind was fractured beyond repair, a final, chilling testament to the power of a single broken door. The civilian response, compliance through exposure. The most critical reaction was that of the ordinary citizen. They had three choices: fight, flee, or submit. The option to fight was impossible. How do you fight an army that acts without greed, only principle? Where is the enemy when the crime is a negative space, the absence of a door? The option to flee was quickly considered. Families packed bags, looking for safe haven in neighboring towns. But the city was huge, and the realization dawned: where could they go? If Valerius could execute an operation of this complexity, he could track them anywhere. Furthermore, leaving Vespera meant abandoning their livelihoods, their homes, their roots. The cost of flight was too high. The default, primal response became submission. Across Vespera, people began immediately boarding up the holes. Not with new, defiant doors, but with hasty, temporary measures: plywood, salvaged sheets of metal, blankets tacked to the frames. These weren't replacements, they were shrouds. They covered the emptiness, but they didn't restore the security. A new, unspoken culture of vigilance spread instantly. Neighbors who had barely spoken now stood sentinel together. But their vigilance wasn't against thieves, it was against judgment. They were waiting for Valerius to look again. The businesses that opened did so with nervous uncertainty. Tellers served customers from behind overturned desks. Shop owners sat in the front breach, staring at the street, their hands empty, ready to beg. The economic machine of Vespera shuddered, but it did not stop. It merely started running on a fuel of pure, concentrated fear. The message had been received, processed, and internalized by the collective subconscious of the city. Your walls do not protect you. They only shelter you from the one who grants you permission to build them. The broken doors were not an act of crime, they were a re-establishment of hierarchy. They were the foundation of Valerius's renewed, and now absolute, control over Vespera. The consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The immediate shock of the morning gave way to a chilling, sustained anxiety. The physical absence of doors was quickly addressed by crude barricades, but the psychological absence of security could not be so easily plastered over. Vespera was trapped in a perpetual state of siege, not from an outside enemy, but from the terrifying knowledge that its ultimate authority could penetrate any barrier at will. The city began to develop new, horrifying routines, rituals of fear designed to appease the invisible power that now governed them. People stopped speaking loudly inside their homes. Whispering became the dominant mode of domestic communication. Why? Because the knowledge that one's voice could travel freely through the ruined entryways created an irrational fear of being overheard. Every casual complaint, every private disagreement, every secret plan was instantly amplified into a potential act of defiance against Valerius. Families stopped keeping valuables in drawers or safes. Instead, they placed small, inexpensive, visible offerings near the entrance. A perfectly polished apple, a fresh-cut flower, a single, clean coin. These weren't bribes for thieves, they were tributes for the boss, small, symbolic gestures of submission, confirming that, there is nothing hidden here, master. The greatest change was the cessation of all private planning. Conversations about moving away, changing jobs, or discussing the corruption of City Hall vanished. If Valerius's reach was total, then every future was conditional. Why plan a life when the architect of that life was sitting in the apex tower? The city existed only in the present tense, paralyzed by the memory of the night before. The erosion of identity, the physical violation began to erode the very identity of Vespera's citizens. A man's home is a reflection of his self, it is the space where he is allowed to be fully authentic. When that space is suddenly, brutally exposed, the self begins to shatter. Consider Mrs. Elena Rossi, an elderly widow in the Italian Quarter. For 40 years, her home had been a carefully curated museum of her life, photos, lace curtains, inherited ceramics. She had always insisted on a heavy, solid oak front door, a proud symbol of her family's resilience. Now, that door lay split in two, its rich grain stained with the mud and regret of the street. Elena found herself unable to stay in the living room. She retreated to the back bedroom, constantly moving small objects, rearranging her linens, polishing already clean silverware. The constant, repetitive motion was a substitute for the control she had lost. She feared leaving, but she feared staying more. Her house was no longer a home, it was a vessel that had sprung a leak, constantly draining her security. The effects were mirrored across all social strata. The wealthy businessman, Mr. Alistair Kane, who had fortified his suburban mansion with state-of-the-art security systems, was found by his staff sitting in his walk-in safe, fully dressed, eating cold soup. His panic was not about his physical safety, but about the profound humiliation. He had paid millions to separate himself from the chaos of Vespera, and Valerius had proven that no amount of wealth could buy immunity from his jurisdiction. The illusion of exceptionalism was destroyed. The doctors and psychiatrists of Vespera reported a terrifying surge in anxiety disorders, insomnia, and acute stress. The common diagnosis was exposure trauma, or, as the nurses quickly began calling it, door shock. The collective sanity of the city was fraying, tethered only by the need to survive the coming days. The political farce Mayor Harrison and Police Chief Kessler faced an impossible scenario. The media, both local and national, had descended upon Vespera, documenting the surreal landscape of open secrets. The headlines were devastating. City surrenders its front door, mob boss declares open house, Vespera, the transparent city. Chief Kessler, under immense pressure from the governor, attempted to organize a major criminal sweep. The target wasn't Valerius, who remained untouchable. The target was the debris. He mobilized sanitation crews, ordering the immediate removal and destruction of the evidence. He was trying to erase the memory. But the psychological damage was the memory itself. Removing the splintered wood didn't restore the hinge, it merely replaced a physical crime scene with a psychological vacuum. The cleanup operation became a second source of humiliation. As trucks hauled away the debris, citizens gathered to watch, many weeping openly as the symbols of their security were pulverized. The government was seen not as defending them, but as sweeping up after the ruler's tantrum. Mayor Harrison, desperate to regain control, called a press conference in front of City Hall. The backdrop, however, was the boarded-up, jagged hole where the great civic doors had been. Mayor Harrison, sweating, attempting to project confidence, Vespera is resilient. This was an isolated, if large-scale, act of criminal disruption. We are replacing all damaged property with state-of-the-art, reinforced barriers. We will prosecute these vandals to the fullest extent of the law. A reporter immediately shouted a question that cut through the prepared speech. Reporter: Mayor, how can you promise security when the current breach occurred despite City Hall having reinforced doors? And can you confirm that the cost of these replacements will be passed directly onto the city's tax base? Harrison sputtered. He could not confirm the source of the funds, which, ironically, were already being supplied by Valerius's organization as part of the repair and reconstruction phase. The city was, quite literally, being forced to use the crime boss's money to plaster over the trauma he inflicted. The chief of police was forced to address the issue of witnesses. Kessler: we are asking all citizens who may have information to come forward. We promise full protection. He was interrupted by a wave of cynical laughter from the reporters. The entire city knew the promise was meaningless. The greatest single act of terrorism in Vespera's history had been conducted by hundreds of men, and yet, there were 0 witnesses. The reason was simple. Everyone saw them, but no one dared to look. The price of being a witness was the annihilation of your family's future. The system of L.A. had officially collapsed, rendered obsolete by a demonstration of power that lay outside its jurisdiction. The rise of the informer with the traditional channels of security destroyed, a new dynamic emerged: the informer. Silas Valerius, in his cold genius, had anticipated the need for communication. His organization did not send out formal pronouncements or newspaper ads. Instead, key figures, local fixers, neighborhood bosses, and trusted capos began circulating one single, simple directive: if you see anything that threatens the new order, report it. You will be protected. Failure to report is the same as defiance. The new order was simple: obedience. Citizens began informing on each other not out of loyalty to Valerius, but out of self-preservation. A man reported his neighbor for speaking critically of the destruction, fearing that the neighbor's rebellious words would bring doom to the entire block. A shopkeeper reported a beggar who was loitering too close to his business, interpreting the loitering as an act of disrespect to Valerius's imposed quietude. Spouses began to watch each other, ensuring that their own partner did not harbor any secret ambition or defiance. The ultimate irony of the transparent city was that while the doors were broken to make the city visible to Valerius, the actual result was that citizens became fiercely vigilant of each other. They were all policing each other, ensuring that the collective obedience remained intact. Valerius did not need an army of watchers. He had installed a network of mutual fear. The fate of the tools as the city spiraled into psychological despair, Valerius tied up the loose ends of his operation, demonstrating his absolute control over both destruction and reward. The 400 men who had executed the door-breaking operation, the demolition workers, the drivers, the muscle, were paid, not in the usual envelopes of cash, but in gold coinage. The payment was symbolic: Old World wealth for an Old World lesson in loyalty. Every man received a bonus large enough to allow him to disappear completely, leaving no trace for Kessler's frantic investigation. Valerius even addressed the fate of Dario, the man whose wound started it all. Dario was summoned back to the apex tower. He stood before Silas, his head wound now clean, stitched, and covered by a bandage. He was still consumed by shame. Dario, head bowed: "Boss, the mark." Silas, interrupting smoothly: The mark is a reminder, Dario. Not of your weakness, but of my response. Santino's fool cut your face. I cut the face of the entire city. Your wound is the most expensive scar in Vespera's history. Wear it with pride. You are now the physical embodiment of the new rule. Silas gave Dario a new, beautifully carved mahogany C.N., a status symbol. The subtle symbolism was clear. He was given a prop to help him walk, but he was denied the ability to ever lean on his own strength again. His status was restored, but his absolute reliance on Valerius's power was cemented. The lesson was complete. Valerius was not a boss, he was a force of nature. He did not seek to punish the attacker, he sought to remove the possibility of attack. And by demolishing every door, he had achieved that total, terrifying compliance. The city was clean, repaired, and subdued. But beneath the fresh coats of paint and the newly hung doors, the deep fracture of trust remained. The city's frantic efforts to cover the gaping wounds of the night finally yielded new, freshly painted barriers. But the replacement doors, even the steel-reinforced ones, were not symbols of security, they were shrouds over a memory. Vespera had entered the new order, a period defined not by violence, but by profound, absolute silence. Silas Valerius did not have to patrol the streets. He did not have to issue new threats. The city had internalized the lesson, and that was infinitely more effective than any physical enforcement. The primary characteristic of the new order was preemptive compliance. Crime rates plummeted, but not because the police were effective. They plummeted because every potential crime, every petty theft, every small act of defiance, carried an exponentially higher risk. Why steal a car when the punishment for even thinking about it might be the exposure of your entire neighborhood? The risk calculation had changed forever. The price of disorder was now too high for the entire collective. Even the city's organized crime saw a shift. Smaller gangs vanished overnight. They understood that Valerius's tolerance for competition had evaporated. His demonstration had essentially established a monopoly on violence and fear. Any rival operation attempting to set up shop would immediately be seen by the local populace, who were already terrified of being implicated, and reported to Valerius's network. The citizens became the unpaid, involuntary guards of Valerius's empire. The subtle scars of architecture, the physical appearance of Vespera changed in subtle but telling ways. Architects, designers, and city planners noticed a shift in public taste and policy, a subconscious reaction to the trauma. First, there was the phenomenon of the relief entrance. Homeowners, desperate to affirm a new, personal boundary, began installing smaller, secondary doors in back alleys or side gardens. These doors were usually plain, heavy, and disproportionately fortified. They were not for convenience, they were psychological substitutes for the main entry, a belief that, if the inevitable happens, maybe they'll only break the small door. The front entryway remained a monument to exposure, now ironically guarded by a small, timid cousin in the rear. Second, the design of new buildings prioritized internal fortification over exterior defense. Developers stopped investing heavily in ornate, bomb-proof front entrances. They now focused on internal safe rooms, reinforced sub-levels, and doors within the building that were thicker than the one facing the street. The implicit message: the outside is Valerius's domain, our only hope is to hide deeper inside. Third, a quiet, unofficial rule took root in many districts: never fully close the new door. Many residents would leave their new, expensive replacements slightly ajar, or place a small weight against the frame. This was another fear ritual, a silent, perpetual offering of access. By not fully sealing the barrier, they signaled, "It is open to you. We are not hiding. Please do not feel the need to break it again." It was a gesture of permanent, voluntary servitude. The trial of loyalty. Marco's scars. The lasting impact of the event was best symbolized by the men who started it. Marco Letta, the man who cut Dario, vanished entirely. His end was neither quick nor public. Valerius, true to his word, had only broken the doors. But the ensuing collapse of Santino's organization left Marco exposed, unable to operate, and marked for death by every frightened gangster who needed to prove their loyalty to the new order. Marco became a hunted relic of the old, messy violence, eliminated not by Valerius's decree, but by the new ecosystem of fear he had created. Dario, however, became the living testament to the boss's justice. His scar, the one that had prompted the city's exposure, was now healed but visibly jagged and deep. He walked the streets not as a tough, but as a relic. People would look at the scar and immediately recall the sound of their door splintering. Dario was Vespera's mnemonic device, a perpetual, walking reminder that one man's injury had cost the city its sovereignty. Dario's power was absolute, yet strangely passive. He never had to raise his voice or draw a weapon. His mere presence was enough to enforce total compliance, for he was the living evidence of the catastrophic consequence of disorder. Valerius's legacy and the future of Vespera. Silas Valerius never spoke publicly about the door incident. When asked by compromised officials, his only response was typically brief and dismissive. Vespera suffered a significant setback in urban maintenance. We rectified the issue. His true victory lay in the psychological re-engineering of the city. He had redefined strength from brute force to absolute, uninhibited access. His power was now invisible, everywhere, and undeniable. He had transcended the role of Mafia boss, he had become the city's psychological warden. Years passed. Vespera slowly regained a veneer of normalcy. The new doors aged. They were repainted, sometimes replaced again. But the culture of fear remained, passed down subtly from parent to child. Parents warned children not to slam the front door. Not because of noise, but because loudness invites attention. Neighbors were polite to the point of being obsequious, constantly offering small courtesies to ensure they were never perceived as a source of friction. When visitors came to the city, they noted the strange, low hum of conversation on the streets, a city that seemed perpetually to be whispering a secret. The truth was, every door in Vespera carried an invisible footnote, understood by every resident. This barrier is temporary. Its existence is an act of grace. The day Valerius asked, "Who hit you?" was not the day the doors were broken, it was the day the city's spirit was shattered. He didn't just break the wood and steel, he broke the collective belief in personal sovereignty. And that, perhaps, was the ultimate and most chilling legacy of Silas. The wall? Valerius. He proved that in the true exercise of power, the greatest weapon is not the physical destruction of bodies, but the systematic, symbolic violation of the soul. Vespera was a city rebuilt on the foundations of fear, and every newly hung, perfectly functioning door was a quiet monument to the day its walls came down. The silence of the city was not peace, it was the sound of millions of people, simultaneously holding their breath, waiting for the boss to look inside again. The city of Vespera marked the passing of the seasons with its traditional holidays, but there was one date that required no calendar: the anniversary of exposure. It was never formally recognized, never spoken of in public announcements, yet every citizen knew exactly when the day arrived. It was the moment the spring thaw began, exactly 1 year after the breaking of the doors. On this day, a new set of rituals emerged, replacing the old, carefree city routines. These were ceremonies of acknowledgement and fear, performed in the intimate space of the home. The most common ritual was the quiet hour. For 60 minutes at dawn, the same hour the broken doors had been revealed, all mechanical sound in the home ceased. No televisions, no music, no washing machines, no even running water. Families sat silently in their living rooms, often looking toward the front door, remembering the cold light of that devastating morning. It was an hour of collective memory, a silent prayer for continued grace from the unseen sovereign. Another ritual focused on the clean slate. Families would take a small bottle of water and meticulously wash the area of the door frame where the hinges had been violently ripped out. Even if the frame had been replaced, the washing was performed over the spot where the trauma occurred. This was an attempt to symbolically wash away the stain of defiance that had necessitated the breaking, reaffirming their own purity and submission. Children, born in the years following the event, grew up learning these rituals without understanding their origin. They simply knew that on this specific spring morning, the house went silent, and the adults looked sad. For them, the silence and the washing were simply the way the world worked, embedding Valerius's power into the very fabric of their earliest memories. The education of obedience. The rising generation became the true proof of Valerius's success. They were raised not on the promise of freedom, but on the certainty of boundaries. Their education system, subtly influenced by the pervasive fear, reflected this new reality. In primary schools, children's art projects often contained a strange, recurring motif: the half-open door. Their drawings of houses rarely showed a securely closed entrance; they showed a door ajar, or an entrance covered by a thin, movable curtain. When asked why, the children often replied with variations of, "So the inside can breathe," or, "The air needs to go both ways." They had instinctively adopted the philosophy of perpetual access. The games they played also reflected the trauma. A popular neighborhood game was called The Watchman. Children would patrol the block, competing to see who could stand still and quiet the longest near an entrance, pretending to be utterly invisible yet aware of everything. It was a macabre mimicry of the self-policing that the adults had been forced into, a childish rehearsal for the adult role of silent observer. The greatest deviation was in their vocabulary. The phrase, "What's mine is mine," was replaced in common parlance by, "What's ours is open." The idea of total privacy was treated with suspicion, even ridicule. To demand total secrecy was to invite scrutiny; to offer transparency was to guarantee safety. The youth of Vespera were growing up psychologically disarmed. The political maneuvering. Kessler's ghost chief Kessler, the head of Vespera's police force during the incident, never recovered. He became obsessed with the perfect crime. He was consumed by the paradox that Valerius had committed the most visible crime in history yet left zero prosecutable evidence. Kessler spent his final years, before an early and bitter retirement, meticulously studying the debris. He had commissioned a secret, dedicated warehouse to store fragments of the broken doors, thousands of pieces of splintered wood, torn hinges, and shattered lock mechanisms. He categorized them by district, time of destruction, and the tool marks left behind. His goal was not to find a witness, but to find a pattern of legal negligence, a single failure in Valerius's execution that could expose him. He theorized that if he could prove that the destruction of one single door constituted an unnecessary act of violence, rather than a necessary act of symbolism, he could get a warrant. He never found it. Valerius's operation was perfect. Every single door was broken to the same psychological specification. The destruction was uniform, complete, and legally justifiable, if viewed purely as an act of massive, sustained, and anonymous vandalism. Kessler's failure became another symbol. The law itself was too rigid to prosecute total power. The system designed to protect Vespera was built on rules that Valerius simply bypassed, using psychology as his primary weapon. The chief retired a broken man, eternally haunted by the silent screams of the wood and the unassailable perfection of the crime. The cost of repair while the new doors were physically functional, the economic cost of the replacement operation, secretly funded by Valerius, was enormous. This required Valerius to tighten his grip on Vespera's economy to recuperate his investment. Valerius did not raise street tax, he raised compliance fees. Businesses that wished to operate smoothly, to have their shipments arrive on time, to pass health inspections, to avoid sudden, crippling bureaucratic problems, had to pay a special, quarterly, security assessment fee. This fee was non-negotiable and based entirely on the perceived risk they posed to Valerius's order. The paradox was that the safer the city became, due to Valerius's control, the more expensive the security assessment fee became. Valerius was charging the city for its own obedience. The city was now a profit center built on its own fear. Any business that protested or attempted to fight the fee would suffer not violence, but the agonizing slow death of administrative paralysis. Their licenses would expire, their permits would vanish, and their supply lines would mysteriously dry up. They weren't attacked, they were simply rendered inoperable within the new, intricate machine of Vespera. The citizens learned that the cost of rebuilding the doors was not just financial, it was the total surrender of economic freedom. They paid the price for their exposed homes every single day, through every transaction, every tax, and every silence. The finality of the threat. The most chilling aspect of the new order was the finality of the threat. Valerius never had to repeat the action. The single, decisive event was enough to ensure perpetual obedience. If any minor incident of defiance or disorder occurred, a small time thief operating without permission, a corrupt local politician stepping out of line, Valerius's operatives would simply deliver a message, often to the offender's immediate family or business partner. The message was never a threat of death or violence. It was always a single, quiet question, delivered with a calm, neutral tone. Do you need the doors to be broken again? The question was enough. The recipient would instantly understand the stakes. The question didn't threaten individual harm, it threatened the collective trauma. It threatened to tear the fragile shields off every home in the city, forcing the entire community back into the agonizing shame of exposure, all because of one person's foolishness. The power of that question guaranteed immediate and total surrender. It was the ultimate, unanswerable threat, a psychological nuclear deterrent based on the memory of the day Vespera became the city of open secrets. The doors stood closed, but everyone knew the horrifying truth. They were only closed until they were not. And Valerius, sitting silently in the apex tower, merely had to wait. His reign was cemented not by the strength of his walls, but by the fragility of everyone else's. Decades passed. The broken doors were now a historical footnote for the outside world, but for Vespera, they remained an indelible cultural marker. The city didn't forget the event, it absorbed it. The trauma was passed down, generation to generation, not through dramatic tales, but through the mundane, silent habits of the home. The children who had witnessed the smashed entryways grew into parents, and they raised their own children with an instinctive, irrational caution around physical barriers. Consider the simple act of using a key. In any other city, a key was a tool of freedom, a symbol of ownership. In Vespera, it became a symbol of risk. Parents taught their children to unlock the door with slow, deliberate movements, never forcing the lock, never showing impatience. The slightest difficulty, the slightest delay, meant waiting patiently, almost apologetically, until the mechanism yielded. Why? Because the original order to break the doors was given in response to a challenge to authority. To wrestle with a key, to struggle against the lock, was to exhibit defiance against the very function of the barrier. It was seen as tempting the unseen power to prove the lock's futility again. The key was no longer a personal instrument, it was an apparatus of appeasement. This deep-seated paranoia manifested in the treatment of all boundary objects. Shutters were rarely fully closed. Curtains were drawn, but often intentionally left with a small, central gap, just enough to allow a narrow, unblinking eye to scan the room from the outside. The people of Vespera lived their lives with the assumption that they were always one-third visible. The Museum of Silence years into the new order, a quiet, almost secret institution opened in the oldest district of Vespera, the Museum of Urban Heritage. It was disguised as an archive of local history, but its true purpose was singular. In a basement vault, far from the tourist attractions, Chief Kessler's collection of door fragments, the thousands of pieces of wood, steel, and lock components, was meticulously preserved. This wasn't a public exhibition. It was a pilgrimage site for a select few, historians, sociologists, and, most importantly, the new generation of Valerius's organization. The heirs to the empire were brought to this silent vault, led by an aging Dario, whose scar was now a revered, silver line across his face. He would not lecture them on balance sheets or territory lines. He would lecture them on wood grain and hinge failure. Dario, voice ancient and raspy. This splinter of oak. It came from the main door of the archdiocese. You see the stress fracture? That is not an axe blow. That is a controlled, hydraulic thrust. Dario, you see this lock mechanism? It cost a fortune. It was built to resist explosion. But look at the sheared bolt. We did not blow it up. We pulled the house out from around it. The lesson wasn't about the tools of destruction, it was about the philosophy of deterrence. Dario taught them that true power does not seek confrontation, it seeks to make confrontation unthinkable. The broken doors were their founding myth, a single act that secured 2 generations of profitable peace. They learned that the most effective display of strength is the one that forever changes the adversary's will, not just their ability. The last act of the architect Silas Valerius lived to be a very old man. He died quietly, in his sleep, in the apex tower, still surrounded by heavy, expensive mahogany, though his doors, naturally, were locked from the inside. His passing did not bring the expected chaos. There was no power vacuum, no bloody succession. Valerius had planned his final act as meticulously as he had planned the door destruction. His legacy was not the vast sums of money he left behind, but the structural integrity of the fear he had installed. His organization, highly specialized and utterly obedient, continued to manage the city with the same cold, systemic efficiency. The men who succeeded him were chosen not for their ruthlessness, but for their prudence, their deep, unshakable understanding that the city's compliance rested entirely on the belief that the doors could and would be broken again if the order was threatened. Valerius had achieved the ultimate closure. He had created a self-sustaining system of governance that ran perfectly in his absence. His power had transitioned from a physical presence to a cultural operating system. The final, lingering question Vespera never escaped the shadow of the broken doors. The event transcended crime and became folklore, a terrifying, cautionary tale. The city tried, in various academic and civic forums, to debate the moral and philosophical implications. Was it an act of state-level terrorism? Was it merely the inevitable result of total corruption? But the final answer always came back to the simplicity of the trauma. The profound change in Vespera's character was cemented by a universal, shared experience of helplessness. The broken door became a metaphor for all lost freedoms: lost economic freedom, lost political voice, lost personal privacy. Everything that had been taken away could be traced back to that single night. And so, Vespera closed its collective memory on the event. It stopped debating the why and started simply living with the how. The doors of Vespera remained closed, but they were forever fragile. Every time a resident turned the key, they were not just opening a lock, they were performing a ritual of thanks that the ultimate authority had not yet found a reason to look inside. The legacy of the Mafia boss was not built on graves, but on splinters. He had asked, "Who hit you?" And in answering that question, he didn't just punish his enemies. He re-engineered the human spirit of an entire city, proving that the most terrifying form of control is the one that forces people to build their own cages and then thank the jailer for the wood. Vespera, the city of open secrets, continued to whisper in the twilight, forever mindful of the silence that follows the sound of shattered oak. The door was the city's skin, and Silas Valerius had shown them how easily it could be peeled away. The lesson was complete. The silence was absolute.